U.S. air bases in the Indo-Pacific region are too vulnerable to attacks by China, and China has been steadily hardening its own air bases. The result is a sharp military imbalance in China's favor. Well, that's the gist of a detailed study by the conservative Hudson Institute. We get more now from senior fellow Tim Walton. Mr. Walton, good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me on, Tom.
And of all of the defense issues facing the nation, that's, I guess, an overarching one is the China rise. But what made you look at something as arcane as what you're calling concrete on the air bases?
It's a great question. It is a bit arcane, but at the same time, it's been a perennial issue. Over the past 20 years or so, many defense analyses have recognized U.S. airfields are pretty unhardened, are vulnerable to attack. China's developing advanced capabilities to attack them, yet relatively little's been done. Our hope is that in this new administration, we can elevate the importance of this issue and offer some opportunities to address the gaps.
Give us a sense of the extent of U.S. base holdings over there in Indochina. I guess you measure it in distance from, China's shore at some point.
Yes. So the U.S. military has a number of military airfields in its treaty allies, Korea, Japan. We have enhanced defense cooperation agreement sites in the Philippines. We also have access to other locations in Australia and a few other places. And then most importantly, we have airfields on U.S. territory in Guam and the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas.
Right. So these are all within easy striking distance of China should something horrible break out.
That's right. What's referred to as the first island chain, which are the islands closest to China, are the ones that could come under densest attack. Airfields in Japan, Korea, the Philippines, for instance. Those could come under the most missiles launched by the PLA rocket force, and also PLA aircraft could be delivering these weapons. A decade or so ago, people used to think that the airfields in the Marianas, in Guam and the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, were far away. China has since then developed a range of longer-range, intermediate-range ballistic missiles and bomber weapons that can attack those places. And their next generation of systems could even attack airfields in Alaska, Wake Island, Hawaii, and beyond.
Right. And so for their own part, China has been covering up their planes in their air bases in ways that make them less vulnerable to attack?
That's right. So China does expect that in a potential conflict, its airfields could come under attack. So it's been fortifying its infrastructure. Over the past decade, our analysis going through commercial satellite imagery found that it's doubled the number of its shelters, it's added 60 runways, and it's expanded aircraft parking by about 75% at its military airfields. In contrast, the U.S. has done very little. We've only added 22 hardened aircraft shelters, almost all of which have been in South Korea. And so this imbalance creates a situation in which China could more easily fly aircraft from its military air bases to attack allies and U.S. forces in the region than it is possible for us to fly aircraft from the U.S. and allied airfields in the region.
Right, yeah, they're close to all our stuff, and we're far away from all their stuff, except for those nearby bases, which are highly vulnerable, in other words.
Yes, it's the range asymmetry, but it's also the level of hardening. So the Chinese airfields have dense surface-to-air missiles and other active defenses protecting them, but they also have these hardened aircraft shelters, places where they can park their aircraft, and maybe they're not invulnerable to attack, but it would take a big unitary warhead weapon to be able to penetrate that. They also put their munitions and their fuel storage in hardened manner. So that makes it so that it requires far more weapons on the U.S. side to attack Chinese airfields than vice versa. The Chinese can attack many of our airfields with a small number of submunition-armed weapons that could blanket the runways, destroy the aircraft on the ramp. And so that asymmetry is not only operationally problematic if we get into a conflict, but it's also strategically destabilizing. It could actually encourage China to start a war.
We're speaking with Tim Walton. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. And by the way, his co-author on this latest article, this analysis, is Thomas Shugart. And therefore, this must be known to military leaders. This can't be news to them. Why haven't they gotten off onto their saddles and done something about this?
It's a great question. Over the years, the U.S. has had periods where they've recognized the threats and acted quickly. Vietnam War, we were coming under attack by Vietnamese mortars and other threats. We built hundreds of hardened aircraft shelters. Then in the late 70s and 80s, we recognized the threat from the Soviets to many of our airfields. Also built over 1,000 hardened aircraft shelters in Europe and in the Western Pacific. More recently, though, we've been slow to recognize this Chinese threat. And I think fundamentally the principal issue is that the Navy and Air Force have focused on building aircraft. So they like building planes as opposed to pouring concrete, which is less sexy and detracts from that perceived tooth of the military forces that they want to invest in. So we're encouraging that paradigm to flip a little bit and to recognize that unless you spend a little bit more on making your infrastructure resilient, and on that defense side of things, you won't have any ability to really conduct the offense.
So that requires a lot of rethinking of budget requests because it's different so-called colors of money in this case. And, I mean, there is a huge backlog of maintenance for bases and harbors and hangars and every other kind of facility already, billions and billions and tens of billions of dollars of backlog now. I guess this looks different because well, the runway's there, the planes are there, everything looks fine conventionally.
That's right. And I think there are two principal budgetary issues. One is the U.S. Army is responsible for defending these airfields in terms of the air defense artillery, surface-to-air missiles that protect the airfields. Yet the Air Force and I think the other services would contend the Army isn't spending enough money in that area. So I think the new administration will need to consider, do we need to, for instance, reduce the number of maneuver forces, brigade combat teams that the Army has, and increase the relative proportion of air defense artillery units protecting these airfields? I'd say that makes a lot of sense. The second budgetary issue has to do with military construction authorization. And historically, that's been you buy a single set of hardened aircraft shelters, and it's a slow, methodical process. We've proposed that the solution to this is, one, to create a coordinated campaign of projects. So you're building across the region, you can get economies of scale, but then also to strike some public-private partnerships in which commercial companies can build some of the infrastructure, provide services, and that allows the companies to build that infrastructure up front, and the government doesn't have to foot the entire bill initially.
And nothing happens in secret. I mean, the minute a concrete truck rolls onto a tarmac and they see rebar there, the Chinese will know it because they probably have drones flying, 100 hours a day over the air bases. Does that change the equation, their knowledge that, they're starting to harden this stuff? We should either say, all right, let's hold back, or let's get them before they harden it.
It's a great question. In this modern era, there's prolific ISR and targeting capabilities. So as the Chinese see this, our hope is that it does ideally deter a conflict. And I think the hardening and passive defense measures, generally speaking, depend less on being hidden, so that the Chinese don't know that they're taking place, but rather on forcing the Chinese attack calculus to change. Instead of only needing to devote 10 missiles to destroy an airfield, they might now need to devote 30, 40, 50 air missiles. And if you can combine those passive defenses with the active ones that can shoot down the missiles, that starts to make it a far more challenging problem for the Chinese to attack any single airfield, or more importantly, a set of airfields throughout the region, and hopefully can deter a war.
And ultimately, we really don't know precisely what China's ambitions are. I mean, there's a lot of scholarly work and a lot of news reporting on what their total ambitions are. But the difference between us and China and the United States and Vietnam of that era, the United States and the Soviet Union of that era, is the economic interdependence wasn't there at all. And somehow that figures into the calculus, fair to say?
It certainly does. And I think the United States needs to do a lot more work to better understand Chinese military decision-making and then also Chinese Communist Party decision-making so that we can invest our resources in the areas that are going to have the highest payoff to stabilize the situation and deter conflict.
Sounds like a good memo to Pete Hegseth.
Absolutely. And I think this question of Air Force, Army responsibility for air-based defense should be one of the top priorities that he needs to tackle as a new sector.
Yeah, that's a good point, too, because the Army is the one that has been taking the budgetary hits as the so-called shift to the east has occurred. The Army seems less relevant to what they envision would be entanglement with China, and so the Army is kind of the poor man out here often.
That's one way of framing it. To be honest, Tom, I would view it as the Army is indispensable. We just need the Army to focus on these air missile defense units, air defense artillery branch, logistics, cyber, electronic warfare. Those are the kinds of key capabilities the Army brings to bear, in addition to a baseline level of infantry and other fires in the area. But it's less of the traditional maneuver forces that were really important in Europe and in the Middle East.
Maybe it's a case for the Seabees.
definitely have a strong role to play in terms of the Seabees, Air Force construction units, and Army units. And moving forward, I think this is going to have to be a mix of both contracted projects